On a summer afternoon at Tokyo Airport, a Boeing 747 carrying more than 500 people took off, bound for Osaka. At first, everything seemed normal, but hidden deep within the aircraft was a fatal flaw, one that would soon lead to one of the deadliest air disasters in aviation history. August 12, 1985. The story takes place in hot, humid Tokyo. Most of Japan was under thunderstorms that day. Haneda Airport was packed with travelers heading home for the Obon holiday. At the gate, Japan Airlines Flight 123 was preparing for its 1-hour journey to Osaka, one of Japan's busiest air routes. The plane was full, 509 passengers and 15 crew members, mostly families eager to reunite with loved ones. For the flight crew, this flight was especially important. In the left seat sat First Officer Yutaka Sasaki, 39 years old, a captain candidate undergoing final flight training. He had logged 3,963 flight hours. This trip would be his key evaluation before promotion. On the right sat Captain Masami Takahama, 49 years old, a veteran pilot who had been flying since 1966 with 12,424 hours of experience. He was not only supervising Sasaki's performance, but also handling the radio and acting as co-pilot. The third crew member, flight engineer Hiroshi Fukuda, 46 years old, had logged 9,831 hours in the air. He had already flown this same aircraft earlier in the day and now rejoined it with the new cockpit team. At 5:56 p.m., the massive Boeing 747 was pushed back from the gate. Outside, the air was heavy and wet. Dark clouds hung low, forcing the crew to plan a southern route over the sea to avoid the thunderstorms. At 6:12, the captain advanced the throttles. The giant aircraft roared down the runway, lifting off moments later, carrying over 500 souls into the sky above Tokyo Bay. As the plane slowly banked right toward the west, passengers settled in, some chatting, some gazing through the windows at the fading cityscape below. As the aircraft climbed, the pressurization system engaged, drawing in outside air to maintain a breathable cabin environment, a routine process on every flight. The 11-year-old Boeing 747, which had completed over 18,000 flight cycles, appeared perfectly normal. Yet deep in its tail section, on the aft pressure bulkhead, lay a hidden scar from years earlier. The aircraft had once suffered a hard landing in Osaka, badly damaging its tail structure. Although repairs were made, they were done incorrectly. Since then, every flight's pressurization changes had been slowly tearing at the repaired seam. Tiny cracks grew, bit by bit. And now as the plane climbed once again into the sky, that silent flaw had finally reached its breaking point. As Japan Airlines Flight 123 climbed to 24,000 feet and flew over the Pacific, everything in the cabin still seemed normal. The flight engineer monitored the pressure gauges, ensuring that passengers remained safe and comfortable. Then disaster struck. With a deafening bang, the aft pressure bulkhead at the tail of the aircraft ruptured. High-pressure air from the cabin burst outward violently, tearing apart the rear of the plane, ripping away the vertical stabilizer, the auxiliary power unit, and destroying several hydraulic systems at once. Chaos instantly filled the cabin. A powerful blast of air swept through, hurling loose objects toward the back. Ceiling panels tore open, debris whirled in the air, and oxygen masks dropped down. Panicked passengers fumbled to put them on, some trembling, some gasping for air, others frozen in shock. In the cockpit, the cabin altitude warning sounded, The captain immediately decided to return to Tokyo. He entered the emergency code 7700 into the transponder and began a right turn toward Haneda. But the aircraft suddenly rolled violently. The first officer realized in horror the control column was unresponsive. The flight engineer quickly confirmed the worst: hydraulic pressure, 0. That meant every major flight control surface had failed. Without hydraulics, the plane was almost uncontrollable. The 3 pilots had effectively become passengers aboard their own aircraft. Air traffic controllers on the ground understood the gravity of the situation at once. This was no ordinary return. It was a jumbo jet with no control. Radar attempted to guide Flight 123 back toward Haneda, but the Boeing 747 was now tossing violently in the air, like a leaf caught in a storm. The aircraft had entered what's known as a Dutch roll, a dangerous side-to-side oscillation, and also a fugoid motion where the plane alternately climbed and dove uncontrollably. Each swing meant thousands of feet of altitude lost or gained. The entire jumbo jet had become a runaway roller coaster. In the cabin, brave flight attendants fought their way through the chaos, handing spare oxygen masks to passengers who were beginning to lose consciousness. One passenger managed to take a photograph of the devastation, a silent witness that would later define the tragedy. In the cockpit, the 3 pilots struggled to focus, forgetting even to put on their own oxygen masks. At such altitude, hypoxia dulled their senses, slowed their reactions, and clouded their judgment. Controllers called again and again, no response. The crew was now acting purely on instinct. Then, a desperate idea. They could still use the engines. Even though all control surfaces were gone, they could try to manipulate engine thrust to turn and climb or descend. And so began one of the most desperate battles in aviation history. The 3 men clung to hope, trying to use the 4 engines as makeshift flight controls. If one side produced more thrust, the plane might turn. If they increased or decreased all engines together, they might adjust pitch slightly. The captain struggled to maintain radio contact, barely able to concentrate due to oxygen deprivation. The flight engineer relayed fragmented reports from the cabin. The tail section was destroyed. The rear fuselage collapsed. The workload overwhelmed them. The reaction slowed to seconds that felt like hours. Still, the aircraft remained at 24,000 feet, where oxygen was only a third of that at sea level. Their brains starved for air just when clear thinking mattered most. Controllers kept calling, but Flight 123 drifted silently across the sky, a ghost in the air, alone above Japan. Yet, somehow, through sheer willpower, the pilots managed to use the engines to slightly reduce the wild oscillations. The plane was still shaking, but a fragile rhythm returned. In that sliver of stability, they saw a faint glimmer of hope. Controllers suggested diverting to Nagoya Airport, which was closer, but Captain Takahama insisted on returning to Haneda, whose runways were longer and better equipped for emergencies. In his mind flashed a single thought: if they could just reach the runway, even a controlled crash would be a miracle. The tension in the cockpit was unbearable. Controllers even permitted the crew to switch to Japanese, hoping to ease the mental strain. In the midst of this impossible struggle, the flight engineer recalled one last option. They could try lowering the landing gear by gravity, bypassing the failed hydraulics. Captain Takahama hesitated. He knew it might destabilize the fragile balance, but finally decided to take the risk. After a dull thud, the landing gear extended and locked in place. The aerodynamics shifted. Pitch oscillations eased slightly, but the Dutch roll grew worse. The pilots soon realized they could control only one movement at a time, either stabilize pitch or reduce roll, never both. Each adjustment drained their strength, but slowly, by carefully managing engine thrust, they nudged the aircraft back toward Tokyo. However, when they throttled back to steady the attitude, the 747 suddenly veered off course. From the ground, witnesses looked up in shock. A Boeing 747 flying without a tail, skimming the sky. As the plane descended, the oxygen level in the cabin rose, and the pilots gradually regained consciousness and clarity. But what they saw was hopeless. Every hydraulic system was completely gone. Such total failure had never happened before in the history of commercial aviation. In desperation, they tried activating the backup electrical system to extend the wing flaps. The flaps began to deploy slowly, and for a brief, precious moment, the aircraft stabilized, almost level flight. It was the first time since the explosion that the pilots felt they might have control again. They radioed Tokyo. They were about 55 miles northwest of Haneda, but that hope quickly faded. The flaps began to deploy unevenly. More lift on the left wing, less on the right. The imbalance grew worse. The plane tilted, rolling sharply to one side. The pilots fought the throttles desperately, but their efforts only made the imbalance worse. The Boeing 747 suddenly plunged into a steep dive. Its descent rate exceeded 18,000 feet per minute, 10 times the normal speed. The pilots pulled back on the controls with all their strength, but nothing happened. By instinct, they pushed all throttles to maximum. The massive jet pulled its nose up sharply, rising to an extreme pitch of 40 degrees above the horizon. Within seconds, airspeed dropped drastically. The controls shuddered violently. A stall warning blared. Moments later, the plane dropped into another dive. Despite the crew's desperate efforts, the giant aircraft no longer responded. Their final attempt was to lower the flaps further, hoping to regain lift. But that only worsened the imbalance between the wings. Disaster was now inevitable. The left wing generated too much lift, while the right wing lost it and began to drop. At that moment, asymmetric thrust from the engines intensified the roll even further. The 747 began spinning violently, beyond any chance of recovery. Finally, the aircraft slammed into a mountainside. It hit with tremendous force, erupting into a massive fireball that lit up the surrounding forest. Air traffic controllers watched helplessly as Flight 123's signal vanished from radar. They kept calling the crew, but there was no reply. Minutes later, a Japanese military aircraft confirmed the worst. A huge explosion had been seen on Mount Takamahara. A nearby U.S. Air Force plane offered to assist in the rescue, but Japanese authorities declined, choosing to deploy their own teams instead. Believing there were no survivors, rescuers didn't reach the crash site until the following dawn, more than 12 hours after the impact. When doctors finally arrived, they were stunned. Several passengers had survived the crash itself, only to die overnight from lack of medical care. Out of 524 people on board, only 4 survived, all seated in the rear section of the plane. The investigation later revealed the cause, an improper repair years earlier to the aft pressure bulkhead after a hard landing. The faulty fix had slowly weakened until it ruptured. As a result, Boeing redesigned the 747's tail structure and added safety mechanisms to prevent a total hydraulic failure from ever happening again. Japan Airlines also overhauled its maintenance procedures, enforcing stricter inspections and supervision. Even today, Japan Airlines Flight 123 remains the deadliest single aircraft accident in aviation history. This heartbreaking tragedy led to sweeping reforms in Japan's emergency response system. Since then, no matter how slim the chances of survival, rescue missions now begin immediately.